The room was colder than I remembered. Not physically, but in the kind of way that makes the air feel like stone against your skin. The Sterling Art Foundation's boardroom, with its towering windows and walls lined with Renaissance prints, had always been my sanctuary. A place where I had grown up, learning the quiet language of brushstrokes, color, and light. Today, it was a battlefield. I adjusted my black blazer and took a steadying breath. The polished mahogany table stretched endlessly before me, reflecting the muted afternoon sunlight. Around it, the faces of those who had once been my father's allies, and now, potentially, my enemies, were arrayed. Richard, my father's longtime senior curator, sat with a calm that almost mocked the tension in the room. Cynthia, my stepmother, perched at the far end, her posture immaculate, her expression the perfect mask of mourning. Behind her, her personal lawyer, David, radiated smug confidence. I tried to tell myself to remain calm, but my heart betrayed me. Every beat was a hammer against my ribs, a reminder that this wasn't just another meeting. This was the culmination of everything I had feared for the past 12 years. The silent, creeping erasure of my existence in my father's life. And now, potentially, in his legacy. Cleared his throat, his gaze flicking briefly to me before returning to the documents before him. "We're here to read the will of Michael Sterling," he said. His voice was steady, measured, the kind that commanded attention without effort. Before he could continue, Cynthia rose. She did it with the kind of precision that betrayed years of practice. The slow, deliberate exhale, the slight tremor in her hand that suggested grief, the subtle catch in her voice that invited sympathy without ever fully committing to sincerity. "The moment has come," she said softly, letting the words hang, fragile yet deliberate. She reached across the table and slid a single piece of paper toward Richard, her lawyer hovering like a vulture behind her shoulder. "It's from Michael," she said, her voice cracking just enough to sound believable. "A more recent document. His final declaration. Written before he passed." I stared at her, my mind refusing to process. I, Vivien Sterling, 32-year-old daughter of Michael Sterling, the failed art historian, the one who had spent years buried in the shadows of her father's brilliance, was about to be erased. Buffering paused, his hand hovering over the official documents. He adjusted his glasses, leaned back slightly, and studied the letter. And then, he clicked something on his laptop. A sound almost too faint to register, but I felt its impact ripple through the air. "Thank you, Cynthia," Richard said, his voice calm, almost clinical. "You have just triggered the contingency protocol." Cynthia froze. Her smile faltered. The perfect act of grief cracked into something raw and exposed. "The what?" David's voice was sharp, suddenly stripped of all pretense. "What protocol?" Richard's gaze didn't waver. He looked directly at Cynthia, as if the years of scheming, the endless whispers, the careful manipulation she had executed had all been anticipated. "The contingency protocol," he repeated, slower this time, emphasizing the weight of the words. "The protocol that secures the foundation and the estate against any attempt to override Michael Sterling's final intentions." I swallowed hard, feeling the years of fear and anger boil just beneath the surface. 12 years. 12 years of silent, careful erasure. My mother had died when I was 16. Michael had been shattered, and 18 months later, Cynthia arrived. Not as a stranger, but as a competitor disguised as a companion. She wasn't some naive interloper. She was a predator. She wanted more than my father's wealth. She wanted his influence, his legacy. And in order to claim it, she needed me gone. First year had been subtle. Little comments meant to undermine my credibility. "Vivien is just so emotional about the art," I would overhear her whispering to Michael. Her voice dipped in concern, a poisonous honey that dripped into every conversation. She didn't see the business side, she claimed. She couldn't manage the foundation, and yet I had learned quickly that her concern was only ever a weapon. Over the years, it escalated. Every exhibition she sponsored, every donor she flattered, every word she spoke in public about me was a calculated strike. She wasn't just trying to replace me in my father's life. She was systematically trying to erase me. My very presence became a problem she needed to neutralize. And now, 12 years later, here she was, waving a letter as if it were a magic wand that could erase me from the world I had known. But she had underestimated me. My father had always seen more than the obvious. He had known the game. That letter, that final desperate attempt to remove me, was exactly what he had anticipated. His eyes, calm and unyielding, shifted to me. "Vivien," he said. There was no judgment in his tone, only an acknowledgement of something deeper, something I had felt for years but hadn't named. Loyalty, foresight, and perhaps a subtle warning buried in kindness. I took a deep breath, feeling the air tighten in my chest. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't break. Instead, I leaned slightly forward, letting my presence fill the room, letting the silence speak. Cynthia's smirk wavered as she realized that the reaction she had anticipated, the display of vulnerability that would cement her claim, wasn't coming. "You underestimated him," I said softly, almost to myself, almost as a reassurance. But Richard's slight nod told me I wasn't alone in this realization. And in that moment, the room shifted. The air no longer held the oppressive weight of fear, but the tense electricity of reckoning. Cynthia's carefully constructed world was about to unravel, and I, Vivien Sterling, the daughter she had tried so hard to erase, was ready to reclaim not only my father's legacy, but the life she had tried to steal from me. Richard stood, closing his laptop with deliberate slowness. "Let's proceed," he said. The word was simple, but in it carried the weight of authority, the power of preparation, and the inevitability of justice. Cynthia's eyes flicked to me, desperation threatening to crack the facade. But it was too late. The trap had been set years ago, patiently and meticulously, and she had walked right into it. I let the memory watch over me, my father teaching me to find the story hidden in the brushstroke, to respect not just the work, but the life it represented. That life was mine, as much as it had been his, and no letter, no manipulation, no cruel attempt at erasure could change that. The reading of the will continued, but I didn't need it. The victory wasn't in the words on paper. It was in the awareness, in the power of foresight, in the knowledge that Cynthia's own ambition had betrayed her. The Sterling Art Foundation, my father's legacy, and the years of my life that had been threatened were still mine. And for the first time in 12 years, I felt a clarity I had never known. The game had begun, and I held all the pieces. The world outside the boardroom seemed distant, a muted blur of sunlight and traffic, while inside, time had folded over itself, pressing me into the memories I had tried for years to keep buried. As Richard organized the documents and Cynthia's forced composure began to crack, my mind drifted back to a time before betrayal, before cold calculations and whispered manipulations had become a part of my daily life. I was 16 when it all began to shift. My mother had passed that year, a sudden illness that left our home echoing with absence. Michael Sterling, my father, had been inconsolable, his brilliance clouded by grief. He tried to shield me, to teach me the world still existed beyond the dark. But I had seen the cracks, his hands trembling when he turned away, the haunted look in his eyes. I clung to the foundation, to the galleries, to the smells of varnish and oil paint, to the muted glimmer of light bouncing off a freshly cleaned frame. That world had been ours alone, until she arrived. Cynthia like a storm in slow motion, stepping into the shadows of our grief with a smile that promised sympathy but delivered something far sharper. At first, I didn't see it. I told myself she was simply trying to be helpful, to fill a void. She complimented my father's work. She praised my small, fledgling attempts at art history. And she positioned herself as a daughter figure in the house. But it didn't take long before the whispers began. Quiet as silk, but cutting as a blade. Crimson, iTunes. Remember one afternoon, standing in the Foundation's main gallery, watching sunlight spill over a Monet. Cynthia had leaned over to Michael, her voice soft, conspiratorial. "Vivien doesn't see the bigger picture," she said, a hint of sorrow in her tone. "She's just so emotional. The business. It's too much for her." I had heard those words 100 times in different forms. Too emotional, too fragile, too distracted by the art. Words meant to erode me slowly, to paint me as incapable in the very world I had grown up in. And Michael, devastated as he was, hadn't questioned them. He had grieved, and in his grief, he had trusted her, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to see, the quiet war she had begun. It started subtly. Invitations to board meetings that were optional but later cited as missed responsibilities. Gentle suggestions that I should focus on my studies, my research, my artistic temperament, while she handled the Foundation's finances and patrons. Each comment, each act, each smile was a calculated step toward erasing me from the center of the life my father and I had built. The time I turned 20, I understood the pattern. Cynthia was not a mother figure. She was a competitor. She wanted everything my father had built, not just the wealth, but the influence, the prestige, the legacy. And the only obstacle standing in her way was me, the living embodiment of Michael's first life, his love before grief and betrayal. I recall one night vividly. The house was quiet, the winter wind rattling the windows. I had been studying the sketches my father had made decades earlier, drawings of galleries he had designed, brushwork from artists he had mentored. Cynthia appeared in the doorway, her smile sweet, her tone soft. "You should rest, Vivien. The art will always be here tomorrow." I looked up, sensing the tension I couldn't yet name. "I'm fine," I said. She stepped closer, almost tenderly, placing a hand on my shoulder. "I just worry about you. You're so passionate, so sensitive. Sometimes that can be limiting." I wanted to tell her I didn't need protection, that I understood the world more than she could imagine. But I had learned early that words alone were powerless against a predator who knew patience. So I nodded, smiled politely, and retreated to the solace of my drawings, letting her leave satisfied that her subtle poison had been delivered. Simmons, years passed, each more calculated than the last. Invitations to dinners where she whispered doubts about my capability to patrons. Comments in front of Michael that made me seem fragile, incompetent, unfit. I learned to navigate the minefield with caution, to never react in ways that could be twisted against me. And yet, every word, every gesture of hers cut deeper than she could possibly understand. She was trying to rewrite my existence, to recast the narrative of my life as one of instability and weakness. And then came the final, overt attempt. the letter she presented today. The culmination of 12 years of preparation, carefully designed to appear authentic, to exploit any cracks in my composure. But she had miscalculated. Michael had anticipated everything, and I, despite the years of manipulation and doubt, had survived, sharpened, and ready. Were vivid, almost too vivid. I could see my father teaching me to truly see art, not just to look, but to perceive the story, the brushstroke, the soul hidden beneath the paint. Every lesson was a thread tying me to the life I had loved, to the foundation of my existence, and to the legacy Cynthia sought to steal. Richard's calm voice brought me back to the present. "Vivien," he said gently, "we need your signature here to confirm acknowledgement of the contingency protocol." I leaned forward, fingers brushing the smooth paper, the weight of 12 years pressing in. I signed, not with fear, but with clarity. Every stroke of the pen was a silent promise, not only to myself, but to my father. He had entrusted me with more than wealth or position. He had entrusted me with understanding, with vision, with the responsibility to honor the life he had built. And I would not fail him. Cynthia. Cynthia's eyes narrowed as she realized the first cracked. Cynthia's eyes not faltered, and the tension in the room shifted like a tide. She had expected resistance, perhaps a tearful display, maybe even an emotional breakdown that would validate her accusations. Instead, she saw composure, intelligence, and the quiet power of someone who had been underestimated for far too long. For the first time in years, I felt a surge of clarity, a cold, resolute focus. This was no longer about survival. This was about strategy, about reclaiming what had been stolen, exposing the truth, and ensuring that Cynthia could never undo what my father had built. I remembered the late nights spent cataloging our collection, analyzing every painting, every sculpture, every piece of correspondence with the meticulous care of someone preserving not just objects, but a story. That knowledge, that intimate understanding, was my weapon. Cynthia could manipulate appearances, but she could never rewrite the depth of my connection to my father's life and vision. The memory of my mother, too, resurfaced. Her laughter echoing in the halls, her gentle guidance, her pride in my early interest in art. Losing her had been a wound, but it had also given me resilience. I had learned to navigate grief, to endure, to observe quietly, and act decisively when necessary. Cynthia had sought to exploit my emotions, to paint them as weakness, but in truth, they were the foundation of my strength. As the minutes stretched, the room seemed to hold its breath. Cynthia's calculated smile was faltering. Richard's quiet authority underscored every movement, every gesture. And I, standing at the precipice of 12 years of manipulation and betrayal, realized that the game had shifted irrevocably. The memories were no longer burdens, they were ammunition. Every slight, every whispered doubt, every subtle attempt to erase me had been catalogued, analyzed, and stored for this very moment. And now, with the contingency protocol in effect, the scales were tipping. I looked around the room, meeting Cynthia's gaze with a calm she could not fracture. She had believed herself the predator, but she had underestimated me. 12 years of manipulation, of subtle erasure, had forged something she could not anticipate. A daughter who had learned, endured, and grown stronger in the shadows of betrayal. And as the first legal motions were completed, and the Foundation staff and board began to acknowledge the shift in authority, I felt a sense of cold satisfaction. This was only the beginning. The memories, the pain, the strategy. They were all pieces of a puzzle that Cynthia had tried to solve before me. But I had the final piece. The Sterling Art Foundation, my father's legacy, and the truth of his intentions were mine to protect. And Cynthia would learn, in time, that 12 years of calculated manipulation could never overcome the foresight, resilience, and quiet strength of a daughter who had been underestimated for far too long. The boardroom longer felt oppressive. It felt alive with possibility, charged with the promise of retribution and justice. And I, Vivien Sterling, finally understood the full measure of the role I had been prepared for my entire life, not just as my father's daughter, but as the guardian of his vision, the keeper of his legacy, and the executor of the reckoning that Cynthia would one day face. The room had shifted. It was no longer a boardroom. It was a stage, and every person present had taken a role they hadn't anticipated. Cynthia's carefully rehearsed performance of grief and cunning had faltered the moment Richard had uttered the words, "contingency protocol." That phrase, simple as it was, carried the weight of decades of preparation, and in its silence, a storm had begun to gather. Richard, calm as ever, leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over the open laptop. The sun glinted off his bald crown, and for a moment, I allowed myself a flicker of amusement. The man who had been my father's right hand for 40 years, who had seen more ambition and betrayal than most people encountered in a lifetime, was now the instrument of my vindication. "Cynthia," he began, his voice carrying the clinical precision of someone delivering a diagnosis rather than a verdict. "You have attempted to introduce a document that directly contravenes the officially notarized will of Michael Sterling. As such, the contingency protocol has automatically been enacted." Her smile twitched, a shadow of composure she had been practicing for 12 years. "Automatic what?" David asked, voice rising. He had relied on his arrogance to shield him, but suddenly that armor seemed brittle. "You can't just— What protocol?" Richard ignored him, focusing instead on Cynthia. Michael Sterling anticipated the possibility of coercion, manipulation, and even deceit regarding his final testament. He established a multi-layered contingency to protect his daughter and the integrity of the Sterling Art Foundation. The protocol ensures that any attempt to bypass, alter, or introduce unsanctioned documents results in immediate suspension of authority, seizure of disputed assets, and initiation of investigative review by the Foundation's Senior Advisory Council. Signaling. Simmons' hand tightened around her chair. Her polished nails dug into the leather, leaving small crescent-shaped impressions, as if the physical strain of maintaining her facade could somehow influence the legal reality that now surrounded her. Could feel it, the subtle vibration of tension, the collective realization that the predator had become the prey. Richard continued, "In practical terms, Cynthia, this means that any attempt you have made to assert control over the Foundation, based on that letter, is legally null. Furthermore, all access to financial accounts, board communications, and archival material is temporarily frozen. You, and any accomplices acting in concert, are under investigation for attempted interference in the execution of the will." Lingering. Cynthia's face was pale. His smugness had evaporated entirely, replaced with the thin sheen of panic. He leaned forward, trying to assert control through argument, but Richard's calm, unyielding gaze stopped him mid-sentence. I watched Cynthia, too, and for the first time in years, I saw genuine uncertainty in her eyes. It had been 12 years of manipulation, subtle and overt,
designed to isolate me and portray me as fragile, unstable, unworthy. And yet here we were. The culmination of all her efforts had backfired spectacularly, precisely because my father had foreseen her moves. Richard's voice was steady. "Vivien, as the rightful heir and executor of the foundation, you are now in a position to exercise full authority over all operational and financial matters. The protocol grants you immediate oversight, with support from the Advisory Council, to ensure continuity and security." I nodded, feeling the surge of clarity and power. 12 years of fear, doubt, and subtle intimidation coalesced into a single, crystalline moment of purpose. The foundation, my father's life's work, was no longer threatened. Not by her, not by her lawyer, and not by the world outside this room. The flashbacks came unbidden, late nights in the gallery, cataloging artwork with my father, learning to see beyond the surface. Hours spent analyzing not just the value but the story behind each painting, the hidden brushstroke, the unspoken intention, the soul of the artist embedded in pigment and canvas. All those lessons had prepared me for this moment. All that patience, all that observation, had armed me with an understanding of both art and human nature, which, in the end, mattered far more than any letter or legal maneuver Cynthia could muster. I could see Cynthia's mind racing. She had believed herself untouchable, cleverer than anyone else in the room. She had not counted on foresight, nor patience, nor the subtle, invisible preparation that had been Michael Sterling's secret gift to me. And now, in her overconfidence, she had tripped the very trap designed to protect me. Richard's fingers moved over the keyboard, calling up the official files, protocols, and a list of temporary restrictions placed upon Cynthia and any associates acting under her influence. The Advisory Council was convened virtually, their video feeds flickering on one by one. Each face carried the same calm determination that Richard had exuded for decades, an acknowledgement that the Foundation's integrity must come first, and that no individual, no matter how persuasive, could disrupt it without consequence. I took a deep breath. My voice when I spoke was calm, but carried the weight of authority. I appreciate Richard's diligence, and I want to make one thing perfectly clear. I will honor my father's vision, not only in preserving the foundation, but in expanding it, ensuring that his legacy remains untarnished. A surprise went through the room. Cynthia's lips pressed into a thin line. She had anticipated fear, hesitation, even tears, but not confidence, not composure, not the assertion of authority she had so desperately tried to deny me. Richard turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Vivien, the next steps involve reviewing all access logs, board communications, and financial statements to identify any irregularities. You may also request a formal audit of the disputed letter, which I recommend. Additionally, the contingency protocol authorizes the temporary removal of any board members or staff acting in violation of the will's terms." The magnitude of the situation sank in. 12 years of quiet manipulation, 12 years of subtle attempts to undermine me, had all been met with an invisible shield, designed meticulously by my father. The realization was almost intoxicating. Cynthia, the woman who had tried to erase me, who had whispered doubts into my father's ear, who had manipulated, lied, and schemed, was now constrained, powerless within the walls she had once hoped to dominate. I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. The thrill of strategy, of foresight, was a heady mix of satisfaction and vindication. I had endured her attempts at erasure, catalogued every subtle slight, and now, with the contingency protocol activated, I had the tools not only to reclaim my father's legacy, but to ensure that Cynthia would never wield control again. She was visibly shaken, though she fought to maintain composure. Her lawyer muttered under his breath, but Richard's calm authority drowned him out. Every motion, every click of the keyboard, every word spoken by Richard reinforced the inevitability of her failure. Absolutely. I knew better than to underestimate her. Cynthia was clever, ruthless, and ambitious. She would fight. She would scheme. But for the first time in years, she would fight from a position of disadvantage, constrained by the very foresight she had failed to recognize. I straightened my spine, feeling the weight of responsibility settle comfortably on my shoulders. The foundation's assets, the board, the staff, all were mine to safeguard, to guide, and to protect. The contingency protocol was more than a legal safeguard. It was a promise from my father, a trust he had placed in me, and a weapon I would wield with precision. Richard closed the laptop with finality. "All immediate measures are in effect," he said. "Vivien, you now have full operational control. Any further attempts to interfere will result in legal consequences." Cynthia's composure cracked completely, just a fraction, but enough to reveal the true extent of her desperation. The room, once tense with anticipation and uncertainty, had shifted irrevocably. The predator had become the prey, and the architect of the trap had revealed himself in the quiet genius of foresight. I inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of 12 years of endurance, 12 years of preparation, and the unspoken promise of justice and reclamation. The game had shifted. The foundation was mine to protect. My father's legacy was mine to honor. And Cynthia would soon learn that every move she had made against me had been anticipated, catalogued, and neutralized. For the time in over a decade, I felt not fear but clarity, not uncertainty but control. And as the board and staff began to acknowledge the shift in authority, as the foundation's assets and operations moved under my guidance, I understood that the first phase of the reclamation had begun. Cynthia had triggered the contingency protocol, but I would control the consequences. Every strategy, every maneuver, every subtle play she had executed would now become part of the record. A record I would use to rebuild, to protect, and ultimately to triumph. The foundation, my father's vision, and the story of his life's work were mine. And in that knowledge I found something deeper than victory: purpose, clarity, and the first real taste of justice. The first spark of victory was always thrilling, but it was never enough. I had the contingency protocol on my side, legal authority over the Sterling Art Foundation, and the silent compliance of those who had long respected my father's vision. Yet Cynthia remained a living, breathing threat. She had spent 12 years perfecting manipulation, eroding confidence, and painting me as fragile. To fully reclaim my father's legacy, to secure not only the foundation but the truth of our lives, I would have to dismantle her carefully built empire, piece by piece, truth by truth. It began with the documents. Richard had given me access to every internal communication, every board meeting transcript, and every financial transaction that had passed through the foundation over the past decade. What I found was predictable, and yet deeply satisfying. Patterns of subtle sabotage, misappropriation of funds, and carefully veiled lies designed to make me appear incapable. Cynthia had underestimated one thing: my meticulous nature, honed from years of studying art, observing nuance, and finding hidden meaning. Every irregularity, every lie, every shadow she had cast became a thread, and I began to weave them together into a tapestry of undeniable truth. The first confrontation came in the boardroom, now under my authority. Cynthia attempted her usual charm, stepping in as though nothing had changed, her posture erect, her voice smooth. "Vivien, perhaps we can discuss a collaborative approach to running the foundation. After all, Michael would have wanted unity." I smiled faintly, letting the calm in my voice carry the weight of command. "Cynthia, unity is admirable, but honesty is required first. I've reviewed the records. The documents you presented today were falsified. Your attempts to manipulate the board and our donors have been carefully documented. I believe it's time for transparency." Her eyes flickered, the first crack in her armor. I could see the calculation running behind her gaze, how to deflect, how to charm, how to reclaim some semblance of control. But Richard was already at my side, a silent sentinel ensuring that no misstep could undo the progress we had made. The board meeting was brutal. I presented evidence methodically, each revelation like a scalpel cutting through years of deception. Emails in which she misrepresented my work, financial records showing transfers that violated foundation policy, testimonies from staff members who had been pressured, subtly or overtly, into compliance with her schemes. By the time I finished, the room was quiet, the weight of truth pressing down like a physical force. Cynthia's lawyer tried to interject, but every objection was met with calm precision. "These documents are verified, and the actions recorded are consistent," I said, projecting confidence I had cultivated for years. "Attempts to misrepresent or manipulate the foundation will no longer be tolerated." The negligence was palpable. Cynthia's supporters faltered, their loyalty shaken by the undeniable clarity of evidence. For the first time, her carefully curated network of influence crumbled. Staff members who had once hesitated now spoke quietly in my favor, lending legitimacy and weight to my claims. I felt a surge of satisfaction, tempered by restraint. This was not vengeance for the sake of pride. It was protection, reclamation, and justice. My father's vision could not be tarnished, not by ambition disguised as care, not by greed hidden behind smiles. The exposure needed to reach beyond the boardroom, beyond those who had witnessed only fragments of her manipulation. I drafted communications to donors, patrons, and artists who had once been swayed by Cynthia's charm. I presented the narrative carefully, highlighting truth without unnecessary vitriol, ensuring that the focus remained on the preservation of the Foundation's mission rather than petty revenge. The response was immediate. Longtime supporters reaffirmed their trust. Donations previously delayed flowed in. Invitations to exhibit work, previously threatened by uncertainty, returned with renewed confidence. The Foundation, my father's creation, began to thrive once more under the clarity and vision that only truth could restore. Cynthia, meanwhile, became increasingly desperate. She attempted private meetings, whispered threats, and subtle attempts to sway remaining board members. But each effort was met with documentation, counterarguments, and witnesses who had been long prepared to speak. I had cataloged everything, anticipating every possible move she might attempt to regain influence. 12 years of experience observing her methods had given me the upper hand. One afternoon, she confronted me in the Foundation's main gallery. The room smelled of varnish and dust, of polished wood and sunlight spilling across the floor. It was a place I had loved since childhood, a sanctuary that had been threatened by her presence, and now it was mine to command. "You think you've won," she said, her voice low, controlled, but trembling just slightly at the edges. "This isn't over, Vivien. You'll regret." I cut her off with a calm that concealed the surge of emotion I had felt for 12 years. "Regret? Cynthia, what you fail to understand is that your entire approach was anticipated. Every attempt to undermine me, every subtle attack on my credibility, Every misstep you believed invisible has been documented. You've exposed yourself, not me. And the foundation, my father's vision, remains intact. Her composure shattered. For the first time I saw fear, not the practiced mask of sorrow or manipulation, but genuine fear of consequences. She had believed herself untouchable, cleverer than everyone in the room, but her arrogance had blinded her. Every move had been recorded, every scheme catalogued, and every attempt to mislead neutralized. I let her see it, let the realization settle. 12 years of subtle tyranny, of whispered doubts, of careful manipulation, crumbled before her eyes. And I did not gloat. This was not petty victory. This was restoration, clarity, and justice. The board, the staff, the patrons all understood. Cynthia's credibility evaporated like mist in morning sunlight. No longer a competitor, no longer a threat, she became a cautionary tale, the consequences of ambition unchecked by ethics, of deceit masquerading as concern. I stood in the gallery later alone, tracing my fingers over the edges of canvases my father had loved. The memory of his voice, teaching me to see beyond the surface, resonated in every brushstroke. I realized something profound. Exposure alone was not enough. Justice, true justice, required understanding, strategy, and patience. 12 years of quiet observation had brought me here, and I was only beginning to wield the full power my father had entrusted to me. Cynthia's shadow lingered still, but it was shrinking. Her threats had become whispers, her influence a fraction of what it once had been. Every step I took solidified the foundation, protected its mission, and honored the life my father had built. I was not only Vivien Sterling, the daughter my stepmother had tried to erase. I was the steward of Michael Sterling's vision, the executor of his legacy, and the arbiter of truth. And as I walked through the galleries that evening, sunlight spilling over paint and canvas, I felt a deep, calm certainty. The reckoning was near, and Cynthia would finally face the full measure of what her ambition had cost her. The game was not over. The Sterling Art Foundation boardroom had never felt this cold. Sunlight spilled over the polished mahogany table, glinting off the documents that would decide my future. I adjusted my blazer, my stomach tight, my heart hammering. 12 years of careful patience had led to this moment, and yet nothing could prepare me for what Cynthia, my stepmother, was about to do. She stood slowly, deliberately, letting the room hang on her every movement. Cynthia's smile was practiced, the kind designed to evoke sympathy, but beneath it lay something sharp, calculated. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward Richard, my father's senior curator, who had worked with him for 40 years. "In Michael," Cynthia said, her voice breaking just enough to sound convincing. "His final declaration, written before he passed. Terminated." I froze, my chest tightening. My father's last words, supposedly, were being used as a weapon against me. My mind raced. I, Vivien Sterling, his daughter, the one who had loved and lived for art, was now being declared mentally unfit to inherit his life's work. Richard didn't flinch. He adjusted his glasses, glanced at the letter, then clicked something on his laptop. "Thank you, Cynthia," he said calmly. "You've just triggered the contingency protocol." The words hung in the air. The what? David, Cynthia's lawyer, stammered, but Richard ignored him. His gaze locked on Cynthia, cold and unwavering. She had walked right into a trap she hadn't seen coming. My mind flashed back to the past 12 years, the subtle manipulations, the whispered doubts, the way Cynthia had slowly worked to isolate me. My mother had died when I was 16, leaving my father shattered. 18 months later, Cynthia arrived, not just as a companion, but as a rival. A gallery owner who saw grief as an opportunity,
who wanted everything my father had built, and to take it, she needed me gone. I remembered the first comment, subtle but precise. I was standing to it. She stilled more as about to especially. A stab shipped to effect. She clicked in E5 the contact of the street. She given when I was to work to allowed. And to take it, she needed me gone. She writ in his head. She find out the statement spashed. I comment, subtle but precise. Vivien is just so emotional about the art, she had said, letting the poison drip into my father's ear. She doesn't see the business side. She had underestimated one thing, me. My father had always known the value of patience, observation, and foresight. And Richard had followed Michael's instructions to the letter. I took a slow breath, keeping my composure. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply met Cynthia's gaze, calm and unwavering. 12 years of manipulation had taught me one thing. Power isn't in rage, it's in strategy. Richard spoke again, detailing the consequences of her move. Her attempts to seize control were legally void. All operations would be frozen under the protocol, and every misstep she had taken was now exposed. Cynthia's confidence faltered, just enough for me to see the fear she had long hidden behind smiles and calculated gestures. For the first time in years, I felt clarity. The foundation. My father's life's work was safe. Cynthia had triggered the very mechanism designed to protect me, and I would ensure that every part of my father's legacy remained intact. Teammates. The boardroom, once a place of tension and fear, now felt charged with possibility. 12 years of patience, observation, and endurance had led to this moment. I was ready. The game had begun, and I held all the pieces.